Well, I'm going to get us started. I'm sure more people will join as we go. And so I'm Doug Shoemaker, and I am excited, and I think we all should be about this presentation tonight. It's going to be, I just, like I say, so excited to hear more about this whole topic. But before we get started, I just got a couple quick things I want to mention to everybody, and I think most everybody's aware of it, but this Saturday from 10 to 2, we're having our solar boat regatta, and we're really excited about how that's going to go. We've got the University of Minnesota. I've got them coming out there with the solar car, and we've got this other boat coming out with the new electric motor and everything. So we're going to have a couple extra fun things to show. Mark's got the 3M people set up again to do some entertaining and education during the pizza time over the lunch hour. So Mark, how many boats do we have now? Oh, we lost him.
Oh, I got to turn my mic back on. We got 10 for sure, and Joey would make 11th if he shows up.
Okay. Well, 7 come 11. That's great. So the other quick thing I wanted to mention is, as usual, MRES is having the Eco Experience this year at the State Fair, and looks really good. A lot of new things that are going to be there. MRES is going to be involved again this year. We've been there since it started, and we're always looking for volunteers to help out. So if you have any time or interest, we'd love to have you get involved with us. We have volunteer shifts that gives you a ticket to the fair and t-shirts. And so if you have the time to join us, and we'll be talking a lot more about it in the near future, but just a heads up. And that happens, Eco Experience happens during the state fair. So fun time, very fun time. So, well, our speaker tonight, she's with MISO in the North region. And prior to working with MISO, she was spent 15 years with the Public Utility Commission, and has been involved in all kinds of various things related to transmission and that type of work. So we're so happy to have her tonight. And so please proceed, and thank you for doing this.
Great, thanks, Doug. Thanks for having me. As Doug mentioned, I'm Tricia DeBlaker. I'm going to talk to you guys tonight about MISO, the Midcontinent Independent System Operator, and I'm going to walk through really 3 buckets of topics. We're going to first look at essentially what is MISO, what do we do, why do we do it, and then move into how the system is changing, what MISO is doing about that, specifically with our markets and other things we operate. And then last and third, we'll talk about a lot of the transmission projects that are going on, because there's a lot going on in Minnesota and our region. I just want to note, as I go through this presentation, I am fine with stopping me with questions, just popping in, telling me if something doesn't make sense. Well, or you have questions or want to know something more about what I'm talking about, feel free to pop in at any time. All right, so we can get started. Let's go. There we go. So MISO is the largest regional transmission organization or independent system operator in North America. You can see on this slide here, MISO is this region, the lighter blue that runs down the central part of the United States. You can see all of the RTOs on this, the right side of the United States are part of what's called the Eastern Interconnect. And so they're essentially all tied together in some fashion, and they operate as a sort of one big system, but within that there are the subsystems of the RTOs and ISOs. So MISO is an independent nonprofit organization. We're a public benefit corporation for the betterment essentially of social welfare. We have main objectives of reliability and low cost for consumers. And MISO essentially covers 15 states in that light blue area. You can see there's some hashed lines where we overlap, like North Dakota is pretty pocketed between MISO and the Southwest Power Pool. The borders of our ISO are dictated by utility membership. We're a voluntary organization, and so the utilities elect to hand over their transmission for MISO to operate it, but they could leave at any time. And because of that, like in North Dakota especially, there's a sort of patchwork design of utilities that are in MISO or in SPP. So MISO's got about 1,000 employees, and we're spread across 3 control centers. I will show you that in just a moment. And so one other important thing to note is MISO does not own any transmission or generation assets. We're essentially just the grid operator and planner. So here you can see our 3 control centers. So we've got MISO North Egan, this is where I am, and this is my region. The states I work with are Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and I work with Manitoba as well. We ensure the reliable delivery of electricity at the lowest cost across the power lines in those 15 states. We also conduct, as I noted, transmission planning, and we manage the buying and selling of wholesale electricity in one of the world's largest energy markets. MISO is one of the biggest on a footprint basis. You can see that we've got about 68,000 miles of transmission that MISO operates on behalf of its utilities. It's got a generating capacity of about 190,000 megawatts or 190 gigawatts. The peak system demand, it was 127 gigawatts, and we serve about 45 million customers. I think really important is the generation mix and the market capacity. So what systems are online and how does that compare with the energy used? And so when you look at the generation mix, you can see we're still about 33% coal, 30% gas on an annual megawatt hour basis. And then our installed capacity is higher gas, but we're using different resources in the real-time energy market. So originally, MISO really formed out of the Midwest Area Power Pool. And so there were these essentially utilities that had gathered together, and they were called essentially balancing authorities now. And they knitted these utilities that were doing power sharing agreements and made it more formal through a FERC regulated process to make sure that there was a transparent method of both interconnecting resources, but also running a wholesale market. So FERC's goal really was, in its orders, it had a goal when establishing the ability to create RTOs or ISOs, was removing the goal, removing impediments to competition in the wholesale power marketplace and to bring more efficient, lower cost power to electricity customers. So as I noted, with utilities being able to come and go, the utilities in our region have changed RTOs over time for differing reasons. You can see through 2001 all the way to 2016 when we had our most major last change where we integrated what we call MISO South. We've had utilities move to different RTOs or have had additions into our region. So I view MISO's role as concentrated in a few key areas. The ones that I think are most important is essentially providing an independent transmission system access. So this is really our interconnection queue. How resources get online and independent resources connecting to utility wires that might be run by a vertically integrated utility. Essentially through a FERC order, it was said that that needs to be open access and that anybody that wants to interconnect can at essentially the cost of interconnecting. That's the first one. The second one is reliability coordination through real-time market operations. And so MISO dispatches both the generation and use of the transmission lines. And that does it on a real-time basis. We have a very big control center. Our main control center is in Carmel, as I noted, but we have a sub-control center here in Egan that looks like a very complicated sort of what they call a airplane dispatch. There's a lot of screens and a lot of controls, and there's some pictures online if you want to watch it, and a video that really shows what our control center is doing and how much it's running. The third one is coordinate regional planning, and I'll talk a lot about that later in this presentation about all of the different regional plans that are going on and for what reason. We've got some really big investments into transmission coming to our region to streamline the flow of electricity across our system. And the last one is operating the wholesale energy markets. And so this is really creating an energy market. We have several different markets. We have the real-time energy market. We have the day-ahead energy market. We have an ancillary services market, which provides additional system support resources in a market-based construct. And then last, we have a residual capacity market. And I think I have a slide on those in a little bit that I'll talk to. So when I say that we are overseen by FERC, we also have some NERC regulations we have to follow, and then we work with our utilities that are essentially owning our system to ensure we're complying with federal and state laws. So this talks a bit more in detail about the different types of markets. And so you can see from big to small, essentially the resource adequacy is the capacity market. So I genericize that probably inappropriately as, do we have enough power plants or power generation online in any given year to make sure that we can produce the energy when we need it? I'm going to skip over the financial transmission rights. That gets one really, really complicated, but it gets to the use of the transmission system. And then, as I noted, the day-ahead energy and the ancillary services market, that's a bit more real-time and more energy-based. And you can see from the graphic on the right here, these are the locational marginal prices. You can see this real-time on the MISO website. Essentially, what is the cost of electricity at any given node or hub in the MISO footprint? And essentially, it'll show you where there's congested areas, where prices are changing. During some of the storms we've had recently, we saw a lot of red, and prices got pretty high. Oh, here's a slide on this. So this is all the different. We have a lot of different data on our website that you can go in and essentially see how the grid is doing or what it's doing. And this data is available. It's public. There's a lot of information that isn't public, but there's a big swath of information that gets you information essentially. You know, how much energy is moving north to south? What's the actual load of our region in almost real time? And one that's heavily used is the current fuel mix. And so these are some interesting things if you want to go poke around on some data on our website. So next I'm going to get into how is MISO run. So I think it's important to note that because of this unique role that MISO plays in operating the grid, it is a voluntary organization, and it's essentially run by a board of directors, but beholden to FERC and NERC for regulation. So we have a lot of members that participate in our stakeholder process because they're affected by the decisions that MISO makes on an independent basis. There's transmission owners are a really big one. Those are the entities that opt to be into our region or into our markets. And then flowing from there are independent power producers, generators, power marketers or brokers, munis and co-ops or transmission dependent utilities. We have end use customers that play a role and have a stake in the decisions that MISO makes, and a few other entities. So now those are the dues paying ones. Those are the ones that pay to be part of our stakeholder process. And then by our construct, essentially there are 4 non-paying memberships, essentially the state regulatory authorities or the organization of MISO states. They participate heavily in our process as they are a big player in essentially whether and what we're doing at MISO aligns with state authority and utility oversight. So I'm going to pause there. I don't think I have seeing any questions, but I just want to make sure I give a chance if anyone wants to pop in or have a question. I'll stop periodically to see if anybody has anything.
Do you have any idea how many actual utilities are involved, between munis, ISOs and others? I mean, are we talking hundreds or?
I heard today the market participants essentially, so it was in the hundreds, but I think the transmission owners are considerably smaller than that. But it's a decent number. So but I wouldn't say it's high hundreds. It's I would maybe guess under 100, but I can spot check that and get it back to you on that, Doug.
Sure. Thanks.
Yep.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Is that Tim?
Hi, this is Tim. Yep. On the slide where you were showing kind of the regional rates or kind of the real-time rates, that example, I noticed that, the rates in Minnesota were, seemingly quite a bit lower than everywhere else on in that, that whole grid. Just curious what, at that point in time, what would drive that?
So a lot of the time the higher prices, they can be affected by essentially gas costs, congestion, and there's other factors that can play into that. A lot of the time, I think our region, especially over into North Dakota, gets a lot of cheap wind that really kind of drives down some of the real-time energy market costs.
Ah, okay. Good plug for renewables. Thank you.
And so, oh, I see Pete, did you have a question?
Yes, I just pulled up misoenergy.org and I saw the pie chart. How frequently is that updated as far as the energy mix goes?
You know, I think it's pretty, let's see, this one is interval. It's multiple times a day, if not even more often. And so I would, you know, I don't know the actual frequency of that.
Okay, so we should not consider it minute to minute, hour to hour, nothing like that.
I don't know if it'd be minute to minute. It might be quicker than that, but I can see it says interval 9:45 in Eastern time. And so it's, I think it's a bit more than a day. It's more frequent than a day.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All right. And so then, oh, is there any other questions? All right. Okay, so the next, let's go back, pop over here. All right, so this is our structure, essentially the stakeholder process or essentially flow. So we have multiple committees that make different decisions on different products or different actions by MISO. We have a finance resource adequacy subcommittee, markets, reliability, and a planning advisory, and the RECB, which is it's a cost essentially allocation work group. And so under those are some task groups and other working groups that tackle smaller issues, but really those green boxes are the main committees at MISO. And those are run by stakeholders and occur roughly on a monthly basis. And they allow for input from stakeholders and essentially a management plan, an agenda, and they work through the issues. So the next one is we're going to talk. So really, you know, where MISO operates is, I would say, pretty near term. And as you get further and further out, you're really looking at essentially, you know, who's looking at the management or reliability of the grid. And then the real-time operations, MISO's doing that. Essentially, MISO has federal responsibility for real-time reliability. So if you go that day ahead look, that's essentially MISO as you're getting out 7 days, you know, 1 year, even like as you move out in time. There's a coordinated effort in that 1 to 5 year horizon through the organization of MISO states, which is our regulators, and MISO to make sure that there's a voluntary survey that we conduct to do a check on whether there are enough and adequate resources for the upcoming year. Those results just came in essentially yesterday. I think they were posted today. And so that gives us that kind of look on, do we have enough resources for the upcoming year? And this year we have sufficient resources, but notably it's getting tighter year over year as some of the baseload power plants are retiring and we're replacing them with more intermittent energy based resources. And so then as you go further out in time, essentially that 10 to 15 year horizon, really that horizon is looked at as state regulators in largely their integrated resource planning process. So next I want to talk about how things are changing essentially in the energy footprint in space that's affecting some of the work that MISO does and how it coordinates with other entities. And so I think first notably, I just mentioned there's a decline in dispatchable generation. And so while we used to be very reliant on gas and coal, things you could just know you could turn on or turn off, because we're using more energy-based resources that are available when the sun is shining or when the wind is available, as we move to the essentially a tipping point where those energy resources are coming online really faster than that thermal or base load is coming on. And before we get batteries online to sort of fill in the gap of the more intermittent resources, we're finding that there's essentially what MISO calls mind the gap. There's going to be a gap that MISO's essentially execs are pretty concerned about, making sure that we have resources to turn on when we need them, and that we're not allowing some of the baseload or thermal resources offline in too early before we get to that renewable future. And I'll talk a bit more about MISO's renewable prediction going forward. Those are pretty insightful as well. And so that's the decline in dispatchable. There's a growing fuel uncertainty for coal and gas. And so those resources that historically would be available or would turn on when we had the fuel and we needed them. There were, I think in 2021, there was really coal supply issues. And recently, I think over this Christmas, there were essentially gas deliverability issues. So these thermal resources that were pretty reliable in the past are essentially in very cold weather having trouble providing some resources. So MISO, I'll talk about it in a minute, but MISO is really looking at, how do you calculate and figure out what amount of resources do we need to be available when many of the conditions and parameters are changing all around us on many of the different resource types. This third box here, the less certainty around imports from neighbors. What we're finding is that the weather systems, while they used to be more smaller and narrower and for less duration, are essentially becoming larger, impacting broader swaths of both our region and our connected RTOs. And so where we used to be able to just, of that Eastern Interconnect, rely on our neighbors to give us power when we need it, or we would supply them with power when we had excess and they needed it. There's been some severe weather events where essentially both regions are constrained in it, or multiple reasons. It's not just even two, especially over the Christmas Eve last year. Multiple regions were struggling with power issues. And so increased forward outage rate, I touched on that one a bit, both for thermal and renewable. And then the public policy driving the pace of change. And so that's a lot of what we've seen this year in the EPA requirements, essentially that are closing coal plants at a pretty quick rate, or imposing costs that would make them staying online be too onerous. So it's just a matter of, do we have enough resources to get us to that future that has the batteries and have the renewables? And right now, there's concern with MISO having that real-time reliability and real-time ability to turn on, to dispatch the electrons that are needed, and whether they can meet that charge with the resources that they are predicting longer term being available. All right, I don't think I see any questions. That's a lot of change, so I just wanted to pause.
I have a quick question, and you might have covered this, but it missed me. So where do the state's PUCs fit in with all of this? How do you interface with them?
So it's a good question. We have state representatives that participate very thoroughly in our stakeholder process. And so there's some, this is something that I was doing when I was with the Public Utilities Commission. And what we would do is look to influence policy and process changes at MISO, but also making sure that MISO is considering essentially our integrated resource plans of our utilities, that what MISO is doing is aligning with where our states are. However, there isn't really a direct relationship between the two entities. It's cooperative federalism. We work together in our own sort of buckets to do our job, but we need to make sure that we're coordinating with our state entities. That answer your question?
Yeah, I just know, for example, it seems like North Dakota has a whole different set of ways of looking at things as like Minnesota. And so it must be really tricky to coordinate with everybody.
Yes, that is a real concern. Essentially, one of the major ones is that Minnesota requires carbon externalities be evaluated or looked at in their resource procurement decisions, and it's actually illegal to do so in North Dakota. And so that makes essentially the resource planning or long-term look, some of the things MISO's doing, it just essentially what you need to do there is sort of have a turn on, turn off ability so that you can see it from both states' perspectives.
I have a question. This is Chris Berta. I don't see in this list a shortage of transmission lines in this list of challenges. Is that built into one of these?
I will talk about that going forward. Let's see, is it built into these? So this are really the changes that are sort of outside in, where that I think MISO would view transmission as really a solution to some of these problems. And so when we talk, I'll talk a bit about transmission planning and what MISO is building out. It's really that transmission will solve some of these issues.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I had a question here. The decline in dispatchable generation, is that future 3 scenario include some battery dispatchability, or is that a no? You know, how much battery could be there in this future 3 look?
So I will talk a little bit about the futures coming up.
Okay.
And so that those futures, nice catch on that slide. Those futures really design and bookend essentially what transmission MISO views would be like reasonable for the region. And we'll talk about those futures and what they include. And it's a lot more, yeah, you'll see. All right. Anything else? Okay, we'll keep trucking. So one of the items I mentioned here is the February Arctic event, and then also we had the Christmas Eve event as well. There's been, I think, you know, as I heard today, a lot of these once in 100-year storms are happening every other year, and so those are influencing very much on how MISO does essentially their work. We're hiring more and more meteorologists so that we can make sure that we know what's coming to the best of our ability. And with each one of these major storms, we essentially have a kind of a takedown team that really looks at, you know, what worked well, what went well, what needed to be improved, because with each of these storms, we're finding new issues that arise that essentially you're pressure testing the entire system in ways we hadn't before. And so with each one of these, we're learning quite a bit. Okay, so this one is really more about the shifting risk during the day. And so when you look, essentially we have today on the left side here. So this is what today is on the left side, and what MISO is seeing is going to come in about 2040. Essentially a very high renewable, high solar future. And so today, right now, our risk is at that peak, that summer peak. Essentially anything below that essentially flows down from that, and we're really covered if you've hit that, if you've covered that peak. But in the future, essentially when you have you have solar really kind of carving out of that peak, really where that risk hour is no longer that peak hot hour in which we all need air conditioning. It becomes when the sun goes down. And so making sure that we have enough resources is really the big sort of concern, that when essentially solar is out for the day and the sun is not shining, what is coming up in that quick ramp period to backfill solar. And so, and how are we planning our system to make sure we see this coming and we're getting the right resources online? And so that's really like the energy kind of the day risk. And so in addition to that is, we have 2 different types of resources. We look at resources that come online really in 2 ways. One is their nameplate capacity. So you have a 100 megawatt, you know, say wind or solar system. And while it says 100 megawatts, it doesn't operate all the time. And so essentially that gets a capacity rating. So how much value does that resource bring to the system when we're trying to figure out the equation of how many resources to have on the system? While some of the baseload units like nuclear has a really high percentage of value that it brings in its capacity, we're finding the renewables and a lot of the resources sitting in our queue and waiting to interconnect aren't necessarily going to be guaranteed available when needed. And so they get a much lower capacity credit. And so you can see here the trend line that's going down, essentially how much accredited resources we're seeing come versus the installed. And so really we need to be pulling that line up, and you're going to do that through essentially batteries or new technology, or other ways are like oversaturating the grid with renewables for different various renewables. But there's different ways to tackle this. But what MISO is just saying here is that they see this coming, and that essentially state regulators and generators we all need to figure out how to solve this problem. So what is MISO doing about it? Here comes the transmission piece. So there are really 4 buckets of areas that MISO sees that needs improvement, and that what MISO is working on internally. So essentially a market redefinition, making sure that math adds up about the capacity that's online and how that adds up to what resources were needed. And so making sure we have energy at every hour of the year, that's the market redefinition bucket. I'm going to go down to market system enhancement. And so making sure our platform that is tracking these resources, dispatching these resources, and the tech that goes behind it is significant and has the upgrades that's needed to run and to make it all work, because it gets significantly more complex than it ever has been before. Moving over to the operations of the future, this is, what technologies do we need to do what we do? So it's not just our platform that needs updated, so our existing software, but it's what other resources should we be using and incorporating into the MISO processes and dispatch to meet future needs. And last is the transmission. That's a big one. That's a big, essentially, I've heard transmission called bacon. Like it makes everything better, and it really, a lot of the studies have shown that increasing transmission will help a lot of these different issues, essentially bringing moving the power around when we need it. Doug, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question on the operations of the future. Do you see AI having a major impact in that area?
Someone was just talking about this the other day. They think that the predictive analytics will help, essentially, both in the speed at which our human processes can process, and then also in the ability to quickly predict. And so I think that, like everyone, that is an area that will help our organization. But as with everyone, I think it's yet to be determined how.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right. So as I noted, there's a lot of things going on. Of those 4 buckets, this is sort of the big ones of how of what we're tangibly doing. We've filed at FERC some big changes, some resource accreditation changes for thermal resources. We moved from our annual capacity market, so doing that formula or math to figure out, do we have enough resources on an annual basis, has now moved to a seasonal basis, as there's more risk in both the spring and summer periods and even winter. Essentially, if you're safe for summer, it no longer means you're safe for the other seasons. So that's actually successfully been filed and is being implemented now. Some current activities, we're looking at how we should better accredit essentially non-thermal resources or renewables. And I think the resource attribute one is really important too. So as we have some of these baseload resources coming offline, they didn't just bring energy and capacity, they brought other attributes or other resources to the grid that were just sort of inherent or assumed to be there. But essentially some of the newer resources don't provide those. And so you have to look at the grid on a more kind of holistic basis on what does the grid need and how does MISO play into making sure that those needs show up. And I'll talk about that in a moment. I'm going to just go ahead and this is really, again, bucketing, what are we doing? How do we do it? And so this gets to the attributes. So the grid needs, I think this one's, there's a lot of things that are changing. As I talked about capacity and energy adequacy, but also having flexible resources and then essential reliability services. And so each one of these is a different bucket or a different sort of, it's really a grid need, but something that's changing and moving to a new future that MISO needs to adapt and figure out a way to make sure these I call them, what they call them attributes, are brought to the grid. I think a really big one is fuel assurance. And so what we've seen with gas and some other resources is that when fuel is expected, it's not there. And that fuel assurance also goes to wind or solar. And so, how do you assure that you have enough resources that have enough fuel security that can turn on when you need them to turn on, among other, very complicated and other attributes that MISO is looking at. So I'm gonna bring it down now a little bit to the Minnesota lens. Minnesota is an energy importer. You can see here from the red line, the retail sales. Below that, it breaks down really what is our fuel mix within our state. This has, I think the most current data we have is 2021 data. So nuclear has actually popped up to 24% of our generation mix. Coal was at 27. I think this last year was, 2021 was the first year that Coal wasn't our Minnesota main resource, and instead renewables and nuclear bypassed coal. And so wind is accounting for now 22% of our generation mix. Natural gas is still accounting for 21. So I think also importantly, it's the 18 to 31% of energy used in our state is imported. As we get to working through our new clean energy law, I think that is going to be an area that has to be sort of figured out by our commissions on what does that mean and how do you deal with essentially energy imports, and who are you essentially buying credits for to offset any essentially carbon that may have been imported. So, and then you can, I think on the right side, I think this is a really helpful chart, and that you can see this is a very conceptual, this is not all the time, but the electron flow tends to go from the North Dakota area down through Minnesota, from the northwest down to the southeast. A lot of that wind is being pumped in from North Dakota and South Dakota, and then we have the Manitoba hydro up in that northwest corner that pumps down into our state. And a lot of wind is flowing up from Iowa too. And so a lot of MISO members, Minnesota is very represented in the MISO footprint and in our stakeholder process. You can see here the transmission owners. Doug, I think this gets to your question. I don't know necessarily about the entire MISO footprint, but these are the big transmission owners that are participating for Minnesota.
Okay.
Yep. And so then you can see there's independent power producers that are also participating, and it's just broken down here by stakeholder type and what entity participates in the Minnesota footprint. All right, so now I'm going to talk about transmission. So I'll pause there real quick too to see if anyone has any questions about the wealth of information I've just gone over. All right, not seeing anything. I'm going to talk about transmission now because there's a lot of activity going on in the transmission space. And so MISO is essentially the entity that has the responsibility from FERC to do broad regional transmission planning. States and utilities still can do a bottoms up transmission plan. This doesn't preclude any transmission from being built. It's just supposed to have a more holistic regional look at what transmission is needed. And so as part of that role, recently, and this hasn't really been done since the multi-value projects, the CapEx projects that came through in the 2010s. Essentially, MISO put together a plan of, we had enough inertia behind us and enough support to say, all right, it's time for transmission. There was stakeholder support to really putting forward big thinking packages on transmission. And so MISO originally did a set of futures for, okay, I want to step back again, the tranches. So I want to just define tranche is just a group of projects. And so there are 4 tranches. So I'm just going to say 4 iterations or 4 project buckets that are happening sequentially in time. And so I'll get to the schedule on where we're at. But what MISO did in looking at this regional plan was establish futures. And so to bookend and take a look at how much transmission do we need, you essentially have to look at the future and say, what is our energy mix going to look like? And so this slide is talking about future 1, 2, and 3. It's since been updated and made much more progressive. So the tranche 1, or that first round of projects, looked at these futures. So futures 1, 2, and 3. But these were conservative. These were not. There were some, essentially the IRA and the IIJA, or the bill, were not yet enacted. And so these futures were still very conservative. They were looking at members' plans, and they were looking at 80% achievement of member plans, and not necessarily as far as these plans are going today. And so Tranche 1 projects were based off of these futures, but since then, and since all of the changes in policy and more pressure from companies to go further, MISO's re-looked at their futures, and so now we have essentially a new future 2A that is more progressive than future 3. And that is what we're using for this next group of projects, Tranche 2, which hasn't been determined yet, and we're in the middle of figuring out what those lines might look like. But so this gives you essentially a baseline that in our next round of transmission projects, we're going much further than what future 3 is at. So I'll show you tranche 1, so group 1 of projects. this is where MISO's at on Tranche 1. This is a big package of projects. This is bigger than the CapEx projects, and it represents about $10.3 billion worth of investment. And this is round one, and this is the least regrets, essentially set of transmission lines in a very conservative future. And so these projects essentially were passed by our board last year and have moved over to the state process, in which they're getting siting and routing permits from their commissions. You can see there's a lot going on in Minnesota and our region. And so these are some really big lines that are coming across our state. I want to note that these are big lines in addition to some other projects that are going on. Essentially, there's also the Excel Sherco tie lines that are coming from central Minnesota down to the southwest corridor, where it will connect to some of the wind resources and other resources that are being built out in southwest Minnesota. But it's a really big line that's going to be in addition to this. And also there are, I'll talk about joint targeted interconnection queue projects, which is also coming to Minnesota, as well as Minnesota Power up north is doing a high voltage direct current line that upgrades that are also coming to our state. So there's a lot going on with transmission. Any questions about this? I see clapping. All right. So our schedule, you can see there's, let me talk a little bit about what these tranches are. Oh, Pete, you want to go ahead?
I'm looking at your map, and it certainly looks like less than 10,000 miles of transmission line proposed in red, which
Yes.
comes out to something like $1 million a mile. I'm imagining much of that cost is what, land acquisition, switchgear at substations, and all kinds of non-wire things. Would that be correct?
I believe it is correct. That was some decent quick math.
It's just a little hard
a
to
lot
believe.
right away acquisition.
Yeah, that would be tremendously expensive. Otherwise, wires hanging in the air shouldn't be nearly $1 million a mile, but that's not the only cost, that's for sure. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Doug, did you have a question?
Yeah, another one is, in the past, we used to hear so much about the not in my backyard, all the protests and everything. Are these lines, I mean, is this like ready to go, or is there still a lot of that, people on the land kind of concern about it? Do you know?
These are just getting started in that routing process at the state. And that's really where, from my past experience, routing transmission lines for the state, that's where the public opposition will come in. And so
Okay.
these are far from done deals. They have to go through essentially the routing process that picks where specifically they go, and what is done to mitigate the environmental impacts. And so that's that'll be a long, probably year to year and a half process that is just getting kicked off.
One question I get often talking to people about this kind of stuff is, why don't we put it underground? Is that even feasible?
It is too expensive. It just wouldn't be cost effective. The cost to put these really big lines underground is huge, like beyond double. I mean, that's doubles a considerable underestimate.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, we're looking at group 1 or tranche 1 of projects. This is one of 4 that MISO is looking at. Essentially, tranche 1 was that north region. Tranche 2 is also going to be north region based, but looking at a more progressive future. Tranche 3 will be looking at MISO south. You can see, I think, from this slide that really it doesn't touch on the south region of MISO. And so we're doing these in iterations. So 1 and 2 are north, 3 is south, and then 4 will be, how do you intertie both the north and the south together better? Because they're currently intertied by one transmission line only. If you go back to the earlier slides, you can see there's just a sliver that connects the MISO north and south. And so of those buckets, this is where we are in the schedule. Essentially, we've moved pretty far into tranche 1. We're in the midst of tranche 2, both picking the futures and what we're planning to, and then picking the lines. So this is, okay, this is the slide that talks about the future 2A, this updated future. And you can see some of these assumptions in here. It's only got battery at 2% in 2032, but I think to that question, it's got battery at 7% in 2042. And there's different, you know, these you can see through time, like what changes and what is expected to change in the fuel mix. And also the pleasant update of future 2A is the accelerated carbon reduction on a quicker time frame. And so really what we're looking at in blue here on carbon emissions is in future 2A, we're looking at a 96% of reduction in carbon emissions by 2040. And so that's a much better and a faster timeline than we were on with, and these transmission lines will enable that reduction because of the different fuel mix it will enable. And so we're looking at a increase in 30% carbon reduction based on this new MISO future. So Tranche 2, this is a all-in map. This is not what we're going to be building for Tranche 2, although we are hearing indications that it's likely going to be larger than Tranche 1. That's a lot of transmission. And so these are different ideas that came from our stakeholders, essentially everything on the table. What do they think they need? What do they want to, what do they think they need? What would be good for the system? And so this is everything on the table, but I think that this is just representative. We will not be building this much in Tranche 2, but it's good to show that there's a lot of different viewpoints on what transmission is needed. And so we're working through that iterative process now on what should be the final suite of projects. And that will take some time through a stakeholder process. All right, the last few slides I have are on our interconnection queue. And so part of MISO's role is ensuring that the resources that want to connect to the grid can get connected to the grid. And they essentially each year open a queue to say what resources want to get onto the transmission system. And essentially through that process, you get an estimate of what it would cost to interconnect to the transmission system. We were finding recently that, especially in this north region, that costs were becoming prohibitive for even a reasonably sized solar project to get onto the grid. But with some of the changes in the PTC and ITC and other things, you can see our queue ballooned in 2022. There is a massive amount of solar and hybrid and storage in our queue. There is, here's some more facts on this, but it's revealing a continued growth in renewable resources, in limited duration storage resources, so really that 4-hour battery. But we don't have a lot of resources that have a long duration dispatchability, which is that gap problem that MISO is talking about. And so again, the external drivers, such as gas prices, federal subsidies, and tech advances, were having a really big impact on what we were seeing in this queue. In Minnesota specifically, I find this data interesting too, is we have a lot of solar that's in this bottom half is our Minnesota data. And so we've got 43% of what we're looking to interconnect to this queue in this last year. The grid was 43% solar, 34% storage, 7% hybrid, less wind, and a tiny bit of natural gas. But that was before Minnesota's clean energy bill came out. Okay.
Hey, Tricia,
Yeah.
Just a question. This is Tim. So can you just explain hybrid? What does hybrid look like?
So it's really a class of resources. And so it's how someone entered into the queue. And really most of those hybrid, as my understanding, is some sort of combination of like battery and wind or battery and wind or battery and solar. But it's just a matter of how they wanted to put in their application type. But it's just mostly more wind and solar and batteries, just in a different combination.
Okay, thanks.
A key fact on this, though, is that historically, everything that's in the queue doesn't get built. A lot of this are potentially the same iteration of a project that's kind of testing the system to see where it's cheaper to interconnect. And so really, while this looks large, I think we usually see a pretty high withdrawal rate and a much smaller actually in the ground number. But we do, when we're trying to hit these long-term targets, we do need a lot more resources to come online. Doug, did you have a question?
Is there any consideration at all in this work you're doing for carbon capture I mean, I'm thinking in particular, like that big plant in North Dakota was supposed to implement carbon capture. Is that considered?
So currently, because I think there isn't any sort of viable projects or sort of a bucket of nothing that would impact the grid at this point. And so nothing for MISO to consider, but we are aware of those projects and keeping an eye on them. But they wouldn't impact our queue or MISO planning processes, except that to the extent if they're collecting carbon from a resource that can stay online longer, like that would, potentially that retirement date might change or something for those resources.
Another quick question. Do you guys have trouble, probably a wrong way to ask this, but trouble with some states? Because I see like a major transmission line coming down North Dakota, but it hits South Dakota, and then there's a big blank there. Is it hard to get the states to work with each other kind of thing? So,
I think I would, from my past experience in the region, trying to go back a little bit further. If you're thinking, is this the one, or were you this slide?
Yeah, another chart I saw, not with your presentation, but it showed North Dakota, with the almost coming down the freeway, so to speak, between Minnesota and North Dakota, and then it hits South Dakota, and there's just nothing there.
So really, those are this is all pretty electrically need-based. It's not. I don't know that we're necessarily finding issues with states saying no to transmission or no, they don't want these resources. And so I think while you might see gaps, I think I have a slide, this next slide actually, on a different transmission set of projects that are coming up. It might look like there's a gap here, but it's actually just because there isn't an electrical need to connect. Those two are probably connected in some other more efficient way. It's not as if there's just a gap in electron flow between those 2 points.
Okay.
So this is the last project I'm going to talk about. It's really my last slide. So because of that interconnection queue that I was talking about and how it's sort of getting bogged down in costs, because one interconnecting customer will try to get online, but they're going to get this, and many times they were hitting really high bills that one developer alone could not bear. And so what MISO did was come together with Southwest Power Pool, because what they were finding is along this seam between the Southwest Power Pool and MISO, was there was an area in which there were some upgrades that were needed to the transmission system that would help unlock the ability to put more renewables online. And these essentially set of 5 projects will it's sort of an innovative approach to this. It's what projects do we need to on a regional basis. And so these are looked at on a cost allocation process, a little bit different than the long range transmission plans, but these costs will be essentially borne by generators. It's a really new innovative way to allocate costs, but it should unlock our queue once these projects get essentially approved for this new cost allocation methodology and then built. But it would pretty quickly free up a lot of queue space, or free up a lot of space on our grid for new renewables. So that is actually my last slide. There's a lot of information. Do you guys have any questions? Your
MISO connection, what happens near Nebraska? Because Nebraska's got a whole different way of running their utilities, don't they?
So it depends on where they are. Would you mean a whole different way of running their utilities? What do you mean by that?
They're like just Nebraska Public Power and OPPD and Omaha are, they operate in a different way than our utilities in Minnesota, it seems.
So I think those 2 utilities you mentioned are part of SPP. And while they operate differently, they're part of SPP and subject to that FERC oversight and making sure their transmission systems are open to generators that are looking to interconnect. And so essentially while their utilities may operate differently, their transmission system is similar to ours in that connection regard.
Okay.
Well, I have a question. In one of the very early slides, it had mentioned hydro, but it looked like it was, just a couple % of the total load. And yet we hear a lot about it coming from Canada, and you showed a transmission line for it. I'm mistaken, what part of the load is carried by their hydro?
So I think this is a good slide that represents, you can see.
That was
that's a
it. The
small-
hydro just looked like a little black band in there. Because
Yeah,
gas
that's-
is big and
That's
wind
how
is.
much we generate. So the hydro that we're using really is considered imported from Canada. And so
Oh.
in this slide, it's what we're importing. So it's that white. It's the difference
Oh.
between what we're generating and what we're,
Okay.
selling on retail. And so really that's where that hydro would fit in. And yeah, you're right. We use a lot more hydro in the state than we use a lot of
Is
hydro.
that seasonal with, say, a lull in the winter and also a lull in the summer for drought? Is it typically?
Yes, that is actually a consideration in the hydro essentially projections is the different seasons provide different amount of electricity.
And are we planning any additional nuclear?
I think I believe we still have a nuclear moratorium in our state.
And so we're not planning any nuclear addition.
I have a question. It's Chris. I'm wondering if the IRA offers financial incentives for you to advance some of these big projects.
Nice, that's a great question. So we are in combination with the Southwest Power Pool and the Minnesota Department of Commerce applying for a Department of Energy grant for that last set of projects that I mentioned, the JTIQ interconnection queue, essentially relief. And so we are applying for a significant chunk of DOE funding to help alleviate those costs to ratepayers of those lines being built.
Do you have to work with a partner like Department of Commerce?
Yes, yep.
Okay. Interesting, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Tricia, this is Tim again. Hey,
Hi.
can you just talk a little bit about like the solar component of the power generation? I mean, are there some real large commercial scale installations that have gone up recently, or maybe Doug would want to chime in too, but just curious.
My understanding, at least in Minnesota, that there was sort of a slowdown of the solar build. And I believe that the Sherco Solar in Minnesota, it's supposed to be, I'm looking at a map on my desk here, but it was about 460 megawatts it's planned for that area. But we currently had a smaller amount of operating projects in our state, but nothing was coming online for a couple years there, some for various reasons. I think some were slowed up in the interconnection queue, but what we're seeing now is that while people thought the MISO interconnection queue was the backlog for a long time, more recently we're finding that there are signed GIAs that MISO says you're good to go, you're good to get on the grid, but they're not being able to be built for different reasons. And mostly what we're hearing is supply chain.
Okay.
Doug, I don't know if you want to add to that.
You mentioned supply chain. Sorry to jump in. I heard another presentation with a 36 to 48 months wait for transformer for substation transformers. Now, is that is that being included in some discussions on your planning now about some of this supply chain?
Yes, those are big risks and big issues that we know our utilities are facing.
Yeah.
So
I have a question. We had a presentation from Flint Hill Resources, and they're putting in 120,000 solar panels this summer. And so are there any other major organizations? I mean, and they will use the majority, well, they use all of that energy themselves, plus they'll continue taking off the grid. Are there any other major organizations that you know of that are planning on doing anything similar to what they're doing?
I think it's, I just heard through casual conversations with some entities, I wouldn't say they're utilities, but I've heard that there are people thinking very creatively, like Flint Hills is, on essentially ways to offset their electricity usage and potentially with solar or whatever other resources they are getting creative to put together.
Yeah, it seems like that, I know Flint Hills, one thing they told me was that, just because of the price of energy for commercial versus residential, the economics were definitely there to make a move to put in all the solar.
Yes, yep. And so with the solar too, I've done this to my own house, but it's good for when the sun is shining, but then there's times where the sun isn't shining. And so, when you think of that on on a small scale basis at like my house or at Flint Hills, but when MISO takes a look at this from this wholesale basis, like that's where that chart is, where you see that risk coming up when the sun goes down, if we have that much solar, which is actually expected based on a lot of plans that we're seeing.
This is Barbara, and weather patterns are, cover many states sometimes. And so conceptually, I think we need transmission lines clear across the country, so that when the sun rises in New York, California could be using it even, or, or it's a cloudy day, it's a moggy day, we're getting, ashes from Canada or something. So we're not so good on solar here right now. But we need to import it from other things. But from what all the maps I see here are just, Midwest. I don't see plans for really long-term, long-distance transmission lines.
So while there aren't ones that show this here, I've at least heard of some proposals that are looking to put high voltage transmission lines more broadly across the United States, and to connect some of these RTOs better. And then in addition, there's the DOE doing a national transmission corridor study, I think asking and getting at exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
One of the famous sayings is the sun is always shining, the wind is always blowing someplace.
Yeah.
Any other questions from anyone? So in general, I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. I mean, do you see most of these projects coming through and putting us in a positive position, say 10 years down the road, or is there just a lot of, politics and everything involved here that's going to really slow it down?
I think we're going to see a lot of change, and a lot of this will be getting on the grid. I think when you talk about those supply chain issues, that's where I sort of see this potential bottleneck coming. And so, I think there will be other resource types that may fill that gap, like demand response. And there's many different ways to package this, but I think there will be issues that we can't foresee that will make us change course a bit. But I don't think that any of the course we're on is essentially going to shake, or we're going to be barreling down this essentially transmission and big generation path for some time.
Do you see any kind of major impact with the smart grid if it ever gets going?
So that's part of what I spent the last year working on was FERC essentially issued an order saying there should be a market product for aggregating whatever you want on the distribution system, essentially your smart grids and your smart technologies. And working through that whole process, there are other RTOs that are going to be out ahead of MISO doing that, but it's such a complicated endeavor. But I think that those resources will absolutely be part of this equation going forward. But I don't think that it's I think every one of these solutions is a part, and it isn't the full fix, and that we need it's sort of, to me, I just always say all hands on deck. And so I believe that's the smart grid and that smart tech will have a role.
I have a question, and it's not so much about the operation, but what about the need for security? Whether, you talk about the smart grid, so that implies the need to make sure that it's not hackable. And then I don't know that this is a concern, but out east when there was actually, and possibly out west, there was actually sabotage on some of these, some of these services. Do you have a comment on that?
It's a very serious issue that's being that's monitored very closely. We have our whole cybersecurity division essentially here, and they are very closely connected with the different RTOs, sharing that information about when there is an attack or what people are seeing. And then NERC also has different entities that are dealing with that, but it is absolutely a key piece to all of this as we digitize and put more information on the cloud. So I think, it's people above me are working on those issues.
Any other questions from anyone?
Well, you know me, I always like hydro, so.
Yeah.
In Iowa, they built the Red Rock Lake Dam as they converted a flood control dam and added 2 turbines to it. It became after 4 or 5 years of construction and probably 10 years of permitting, it became a 36 megawatt facility constant. Is there any thoughts of bringing that on in our local area? Because there's lots and lots of flood control dams. I'm sure not all of them are suitable, but it's just another source of energy.
So, I haven't heard too much about new hydro in I guess I would say just even in our region. I think we're starting to hit this point of like conflicting policies. And so essentially there's environmental implications on new hydro that people that essentially stop it from even starting or being a point of conversation. But when we're talking about climate change and some of the bigger risks we're trying to mitigate long term, I think you might see some more of those resources coming to the tables as options. But I haven't heard too much talk about that kind of project. All right, I think we're actually going to hit that 7:15 limit, Doug. I didn't think we would.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you so much for this. Is great. I mean, it's a little bit complicated, as they say. Wow. I like most of us are way out on the edge of this. I can't even imagine what it's like trying to deal with it internally. So I want to thank you so much for your presentation. And I also want to just share with people that next month on the 15th, we'll be having a presenter from Connexus, and he'll be talking about some of the things that they're doing at that company with solar and storage and other projects that they're working on. So, and also working on the other side of the coin of trying to reduce energy usage, electrify, but reduce usage. So that should be interesting. So again, thank you so much. And those of us with MRES will be moving on to our board meeting, and we'll talk to you all later. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.